make that decision.
Well, I don't want to say that, but it's not only land
strikes.
strikes on Venezuela. It's land strikes on horrible people that are bringing in drugs and killing our people. You know, if we were in a war and we lost 300,000 people in a year, because that's what the real number is. It's not 100. You know, you keep hearing 100. And it's a lot worse than that because the families are devastated when they lose their child. If we were in a war and we lost 200,000 or 300,000, but I think it's more than 300,000, and that's a war that's like a war that would be unparalleled. Nobody's ever seen anything like that, and that's what's happening. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in Venezuela. It's people that are bringing in drugs to our country are targets.
Listen to these words again because they're the clarion call of a despot, emboldened beyond precedent, beyond constitutional constraint, beyond any shred of humility before international law or human decency, when Trump stands before cameras and declares that people bringing drugs into our country are military targets. He's not merely proposing policy, he's inaugurating a doctrine that rewrites the most fundamental premise of executive power, transforming the presidency into a roving death squad with global jurisdiction and no meaningful checks whatsoever. And what makes this moment all the more chilling is how he frames it, through this perverse arithmetic of suffering, comparing overdose deaths to wartime casualties, as if the comparison itself grants him the powers of a wartime commander-in-chief, as if metaphor becomes mandate and rhetoric transmutes into unlimited violence. This is not theoretical anymore, because since September the United States military has already executed airstrikes on vessels in the Caribbean Sea, positioned by this administration as a mission to fight drug trafficking, with at least 87 people killed in at least 22 strikes on 23 vessels. And now we're watching Trump in this clip refuse to rule out land strikes on Venezuela itself, speaking with the casual malevolence of someone who understands he's already crossed the Rubicon and knows the Senate won't stop him because the Senate has twice rejected resolutions that would limit his authority to continue military action, and congressional Republicans have largely fallen in line with this madness, even as experts, human rights groups, and international bodies said the killings were illegal under U.S. and international law, with both Colombian and Venezuelan governments accusing the U.S. of extrajudicial murder, which is precisely what this is, but we can't even get our heads around the magnitude of constitutional crisis unfolding before us, because the violations cascade faster than our capacity to process them. What you're witnessing here is the most dangerous expansion of unilateral presidential war, powers in modern American history, wrapped in the cynical pretext of drug policy enforcement deployed against a sovereign nation, thousands of miles from our shores, with zero congressional authorization. And wait, there's more, because reporting emerged that 2 anonymous sources said Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had given a verbal order to SEAL Team 6 to leave no survivors, that 2 men who survived the initial strike were killed in a subsequent double-tap strike, which is a textbook war crime under the Geneva Conventions. But we're supposed to just accept this as normal, because Trump invokes the magic word drugs, and suddenly constitutional guardrails evaporate, international law becomes irrelevant, and human beings on fishing boats become what he calls targets in a war that was never declared by Congress, that operates under legal authorities so murky and classified that even UK intelligence agencies stopped sharing information with the US following an order by their Attorney General over serious concerns about the legality of these strikes, and reporting revealed that Southcom's senior military lawyer raised serious concerns over the legality and was overruled, meaning even our own military legal experts knew this violated the law and were simply steamrolled by an executive branch drunk on its own impunity. Now let's talk about the drug death numbers Trump keeps weaponizing, because yes, overdose deaths are a genuine crisis, but provisional data from the CDC indicate there were an estimated 80,391 drug overdose deaths in the United States during 2024, a decrease of 26.9% from the 110,037 deaths estimated in 2023, which means even as Trump launches this extrajudicial killing campaign, overdose deaths were already declining, dramatically before these maritime strikes began in September. So the entire premise is empirically fraudulent. The supposed war he's prosecuting against drug deaths was already being won through public health interventions, through naloxone distribution, through treatment access, not through drone strikes on Venezuelan fishing boats. And when Trump throws around numbers like 300,000 deaths, he's inflating figures beyond recognition, engaging in the kind of threat inflation that authoritarian leaders have used throughout history to justify emergency powers. And when you compare a public health crisis to Pearl Harbor, or to a military invasion, you're doing ideological work, you're manufacturing the predicate for war powers that the Constitution never granted you, And this matters because history and the Constitution itself show that the president is not free to change the constitutionally mandated allocation of war powers, and the president's role as commander-in-chief was intended to institutionalize civilian control over the military. Absent an immediate threat, the president may only execute Congress's decision to initiate war. Yet here we are watching Trump explicitly declare an entire category of people as military targets, with an expansive borderless justification that doesn't stop at Venezuela, because he says it doesn't necessarily have to be in Venezuela, meaning he's claiming the authority to strike anywhere on Earth. Anyone he designates as a drug trafficker becomes fair game for assassination without trial, without due process, without congressional authorization. The constitutional crisis here runs even deeper than the immediate violence, because Trump has manufactured the Venezuela crisis not to grab more oil, but to expand his executive power with what makes this deployment unprecedented, not being its size, but the absence of congressional authorization. Lawmakers from both parties complained they were not provided with legal justification, target lists or evidence about those killed, while the Senate twice rejected resolutions to limit Trump's military authority, leaving executive power effectively unchecked. And this is where the progressive critique must be absolutely unsparing, because the architecture of unchecked executive power that Trump is exploiting was built over decades by presidents of both parties who expanded the war on terror, who stretched AUMs beyond recognition, who normalized drone warfare and kill lists, and the entire apparatus of the national security state that operates in shadows beyond congressional oversight. And now Trump has taken that infrastructure and turned it toward Latin America, invoking not terrorism, but drugs as his magic justification. Senator Lindsey Graham made the administration's objective explicit, telling CBS that regime change is the goal, and Trump has all the authority in the world to conduct strikes, which is a legal claim, so absurd, so contrary to constitutional text and structure, that it would have been laughed out of any serious legal forum 50 years ago, but now it's just accepted Republican orthodoxy that presidents can launch wars whenever they want against whoever they want for whatever reason they deem sufficient. And the Venezuela angle here is absolutely crucial to understand, because Venezuelan opposition figures, Trump administration sources, and independent political analysts have suggested that the U.S.'s true motive is regime change, not drug interdiction, and the evidence for this is overwhelming. Trump deployed the most advanced U.S. aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, along with B-52 bombers, F-35 fighters, submarines, and more than 15,000 personnel, representing the most significant U.S. military presence in Latin America since the Cold War. And Trump confirmed he authorized the CIA to carry out secret operations in Venezuela, while the country has been conducting regular military drills in preparation for possible attack. And this is happening against the backdrop of Trump's national security strategy, laying out what it calls a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere, with the 1823 Monroe Doctrine having been used to justify U.S. military interventions in Latin America, which brings us face to face with one of the most shameful persistent patterns in American foreign policy, the century and a half of U.S. imperial violence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean that has destabilized governments, murdered tens of thousands, installed dictators, backed death squads, and created the very conditions of violence and migration that Trump now invokes to justify more intervention. The historical record here is damning beyond measure, because the United States participated directly or indirectly in Latin American regime change more than 40 times in the last century, according to historian John Coatsworth, and that figure doesn't include a number of failed missions like the 1961 Bay of Pigs assault in Cuba, and we're talking about State Department officials and CIA agents intimately involved in training Guatemalan security forces who killed thousands during civil war, the CIA attempting to thwart Allende, and supporting General Augusto Pinochet, whose regime murdered 3,065 citizens and committed human rights abuses against almost 40,000, backing the right-wing Contra rebels in Nicaragua, leading to a decade of violent struggle, and Venezuela itself. The U.S. gave tacit approval of a coup attempt against Hugo Chavez in 2002, and this pattern extends through Operation Condor in the 1970s, when Argentina, Chile, and allied South American nations launched brutal campaigns of repression and assassination, with U.S. support, Reagan backing anti-communist Contras, and the Salvadoran government and U.S. forces invading Grenada in 1983, and on through Panama and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and this legacy casts a long shadow because the U.S. military deployment and drone and missile strikes in the Caribbean and Pacific have awakened ghosts of the 20th century, with several of the region's governments forcefully criticizing the possibility of U.S. intervention that they regard as an imperialist tactic, and Trump's invocation of the Monroe Doctrine is particularly galling because that doctrine has been the rhetorical cover for more than a century of American imperialism, the ideological framework through which we claimed the entire hemisphere as our sphere of influence and justified overthrowing any government we deemed insufficiently compliant with American corporate interests. What makes Trump's current actions even more unconscionable is that experts say Venezuela is not the main source of drugs such as cocaine being smuggled into the U.S. The Trump administration has justified the attacks as national security threats, but has provided no evidence of drug trafficking, and reporting indicates that Venezuelan sources identified those killed in the first strike as fishermen, not narco-terrorists, though the administration called them narco-terrorists, with investigations revealing the first attack included a second strike to kill 2 survivors clinging to wreckage, a potential war crime under international law. So we're not even talking about drug kingpins or cartel leaders, we're talking about impoverished fishermen executed by missile strikes from drones operated by the most powerful military on Earth, and then finished off with follow-up strikes to ensure no survivors, which is precisely the kind of ruthless murder that Americans recoil from when committed by our adversaries, but somehow becomes acceptable, counter-narcotic, when carried out under our flag, and the hypocrisy is so thick you could choke on it because during the Trump administration's second term, the U.S. intensified its focus on drug cartels, characterizing the smugglers as terrorist, applying the entire post-9/11 framework of endless war and extrajudicial killing to a completely different problem that requires public health solutions, not military ones. The sheer audacity of Trump standing there and saying people that are bringing in drugs to our country are targets, declaring that it doesn't necessarily have to be in Venezuela, is him claiming powers that would make Julius Caesar blush because he's asserting the right to unilaterally designate anyone anywhere as an enemy combatant, and order their execution based solely on his determination that they're involved in drug trafficking, with no due process, no presentation of evidence to Congress, no international legal framework, just executive decree as judge, jury, and executioner on a global scale. And the fact that he frames this through this comparison to war casualties is doing enormous ideological lifting, because war is the one circumstance under which presidents have historically claimed expanded powers, but drug trafficking is not war. It's not an armed attack on the United States by a foreign military. It's a complex transnational criminal enterprise intertwined with poverty and corruption, and demand within the United States itself, and treating it as war is a category error, designed to justify war powers, and when you combine this with the administration's new national security strategy which elevates mass migration and the Western Hemisphere to top priorities, declaring mass migration the major external threat to the United States more than China, Russia, or terrorism, you see the full architecture of a nativist authoritarian foreign policy that treats Latin American countries as subordinate territories where American power can be exercised without constraint. This is where we need to connect the domestic and foreign policy dimensions of Trumpism, because the same xenophobic demagoguery that drives his immigration policies, the same racist fear-mongering about dangerous foreigners threatening American communities, is now being weaponized to justify military strikes abroad, and the progression is perfectly logical in its horror. If you accept the premise that immigration is an existential threat, then suddenly military action to stop migration at its source becomes thinkable. If you accept that drug deaths are equivalent to war casualties, then military campaigns against supposed drug sources become justifiable, and what Trump is constructing here is a feedback loop of fear and violence, where domestic anxieties about drugs and immigration are transformed into justifications for imperial violence abroad, which will inevitably create more instability, more migration, more of the very problems he claims to be solving, and this is the enduring pattern of American empire. The intervention creates chaos, the chaos produces refugees, the refugees are demonized to justify more intervention, and throughout the cycle, American weapons manufacturers and defense contractors profit enormously, while poor communities in Latin America and poor communities in the United States both pay the price in blood and treasure. The constitutional scholars and legal experts watching this unfold have been sounding alarm bells because legal experts broadly characterize the maritime attacks as illegal under both U.S. and international law, and many legal experts believe the strikes to be unlawful extrajudicial killings, yet Trump proceeds undeterred because he understands that the structures of accountability have been so thoroughly degraded that he can commit war crimes in broad daylight and face no consequences, and this is the natural endpoint of decades of bipartisan expansion of executive power. The imperial presidency that Arthur Schlesinger warned about in the 1970s has metastasized into something even more dangerous, a presidency that claims the power to wage undeclared wars across multiple countries simultaneously, to assassinate anyone it designates as a threat, to operate in complete secrecy with classified legal memos justifying whatever violence the president desires, and what's particularly insidious is how the crisis manufactures a threat, precisely calibrated to validate expanded executive power, because labeling drug trafficking as terrorism permits the exercise of authority without Congress, without oversight, and increasingly without resistance, which means Trump has found the perfect vehicle for authoritarian power consolidation, a problem that genuinely worries many Americans, weaponized into a justification for unlimited presidential violence. And we haven't even fully grappled with what comes next, because Trump in this clip explicitly refuses to rule out land strikes, meaning ground operations inside Venezuela, which would be an act of war against a sovereign nation, with whom we have no mutual defense treaty, no UN Security Council authorization, no congressional AUMF, nothing but Trump's unilateral decision that he has the right to. Analysts say the U.S. has several military options for striking Venezuela with the pieces in place for an air and missile attack, and likely long-range missiles from air and sea, because Venezuela has relatively strong air defenses. The doubt still shrouds Trump's aims in Venezuela, but the symbolic weight of the massive U.S. naval force means any resolution that does not lead to Maduro's ouster would be a rebuke to U.S. power and Trump's prestige, which tells you everything about the actual motivations here. This isn't about drugs or national security. This is about Trump's ego, about demonstrating American dominance, about regime change, wrapped in the pretext of counter-narcotics, exactly the kind of imperial adventure that has failed catastrophically again and again throughout American history, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Everywhere we've tried to impose our will through military force, we've created disaster and suffering and blowback, and now Trump wants to repeat the cycle in Latin America. The progressive response to this cannot be tepid, cannot be equivocal, cannot be another round of hand-wringing about norms and institutions that have already collapsed. We need to be absolutely clear that Trump is committing war crimes, that he's violating the Constitution, that he's launching a legal war of aggression, and that every single member of Congress who enables this through silence or active support is complicit in murder and regime change and imperial violence, and we need to situate this within the broader pattern of American empire, the long bloody history of intervention in Latin America that has produced coups and death squads and disappeared people and generational trauma, and the fact that this history gets memory holed over and over again, allowing each new administration to present its interventions as somehow different, somehow justified, somehow necessary, is a kind of willful historical amnesia that enables ongoing atrocities, and when Trump invokes the Monroe Doctrine, he's tapping into this tradition, he's making explicit what's usually left implicit, the claim that the United States has the right to dominate the Western Hemisphere, to overthrow governments. We dislike to treat sovereign nations as American protectorates, and the fact that he's doing this while also releasing a national security strategy that paints European allies as weak accuses them of facing prospect of civilizational erasure due to immigration, declining birth rates, censorship, and loss of national identities, while suggesting it's far from obvious whether certain European countries will remain reliable allies, tells you about the broader authoritarian turn in American foreign policy, the alignment with right-wing nationalist movements globally, the contempt for international institutions and multilateralism, the raw power politics unmoored from any pretense of liberal values or human rights. What we're watching is the fusion of domestic authoritarianism with imperial violence abroad, and the link between them is this ideology of nationalist exclusion, this idea that the purity and security of the nation justifies any level of violence against those deemed outsiders or threats. And when Trump declares drug traffickers are targets, he's deploying the same dehumanizing logic that underlies his immigration policies, the same logic that produces family separation and mass deportation, and the same logic that throughout history has justified genocide and ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. And yes, that sounds hyperbolic, until you remember that we're already talking about 87 people killed, already talking about double-tap strikes to kill survivors, already talking about a massive military buildup and threatened invasion. And this is just the beginning, because once you've normalized extrajudicial killings, once you've established that the president can unilaterally designate targets for assassination, once you've accepted that drug policy justifies military action, there's no logical stopping point. The precedent expands infinitely, and future presidents will cite Trump's actions to justify their own lawless violence. The question facing Americans right now, especially those of us who understand the stakes, is whether we have the political courage to resist this, whether we're willing to call it what it is, imperial aggression, illegal warfare, crimes against humanity, whether we're willing to organize and protest and demand congressional action and challenge this in courts and build international pressure and solidarity with the Venezuelan people who are already suffering under economic collapse and political repression, and now face the prospect of becoming collateral damage in someone else's power consolidation project. And we need to be clear-eyed about the obstacles because congressional Republicans have largely expressed public support for the strikes even as the tactic has come under withering criticism from Democrats. And the mainstream media coverage has been catastrophically inadequate, normalizing this as just another foreign policy debate rather than the constitutional crisis and humanitarian catastrophe it represents. And there's this exhausting both sides framing where criticizing illegal American wars somehow gets portrayed as defending dictators like Maduro, when the obvious truth is you can oppose both authoritarian regimes and illegal American interventions. You can support the Venezuelan people's struggle for democracy without supporting American bombs and missiles. This moment demands moral clarity. It demands that we excavate and confront the full history of American imperialism in Latin America, that we recognize the pattern, that we refuse to be gaslit into treating Trump's lawless violence as somehow normal or defensible or necessary, and it demands that we build movements strong enough to constrain executive power, to reassert congressional war powers, to dismantle the infrastructure of permanent war and surveillance and intervention that has been constructed over decades. And this isn't just about Trump, although he's uniquely dangerous. It's about the bipartisan national security establishment that has enabled the growth of executive power. It's about the military-industrial complex that profits from endless war. It's about the entire ideology of American exceptionalism that teaches us we have the right to dominate the world. And when Trump stands there and casually discusses land strikes and calls human beings targets, he's revealing the moral rot at the heart of American empire, the callous disregard for foreign lives, the assumption that American power justifies American violence. And every single person watching this needs to ask themselves whether this is the country they want to live in, whether this is the legacy they want to leave, whether silence and complicity in the face of war crimes is morally sustainable. And the answer has to be resistance, has to be organizing, has to be building the mass movements capable of stopping this machinery of death before it consumes us all.